Okay, so I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out how decision-making power in a capitalist society can possibly become centralized. Um, Spoiler alert: it's going to do with big, corrupt money influencing policy, decision-making, decision-making in the government. Um, the motivation for trying to understand this is as we react to, what is clearly, basically, worldwide corruption and corruption within our own White House, Donald Trump, etc. So as we react to the Donald Trump White House and the Donald Trump evil out there, I see a particular trend happening that I don't like, which is basically a mental calculation that makes pretty good sense on the face of things, but is ultimately self-destructive in the long run or in the short term. Basically, it goes, Trump equal bad, therefore Republican equal bad, therefore Democrat equal good. Okay. So that's a problem because the stereotype of Republicans is that they're the small government party. It couldn't be further from the truth for a long time. I don't feel like I have to prove these points. I feel like they'll be conceded pretty easily by most people. But especially now in the Trump White House, where we just casually put ideas on the table like serving a third term or taking over a foreign country, and where we talk about things that really don't make sense, like according to the stereotypical idea of what you think America is, but things that do make sense according to like a power consolidation environment. Things that make a lot more sense in a power consolidation way. It all seems to be happening more and more. And so that reaction seems to take place. So the quote-unquote stereotypical idea of the Republicans is that they're the small government party. They're the quote-unquote capitalist party, and that Democrats are the larger government party, and with more or less validity here and there, depending on your candidates who are in play. Like Bernie Sanders was, very favorable towards socialism, and you do hear the idea played around with, like variants of socialism. But anyways, I don't want to belabor the point. The point is that the Democrats are more like, big government, socialist, communist sort of thing. These are the stereotypes that go around. So these stereotypes, they're not perfect, they're not exact, and you could go down the rabbit hole and try to figure out what exactly is happening, but I don't want to do that. I want to deal in the big picture slices of things. So I'm going to work with these really overly simplistic ideas to explain myself. So basically, there is only two types of government, and I think a lot of people don't understand what capitalism is. Or maybe like the word is so deformed nowadays that it doesn't even have the same meaning as it used to be. Fortunately for that, we don't need the word capitalism or the other isms at all, because if you think about what government is in a simple, like overly simple way, you'll find that there's really only two types of government. One of them, which would be called capitalism, but one of them is where rights and freedoms and choice exist to the individuals in the society. And of course, the other one would be where those things are consolidated into the hands of a few. That's the defining characteristic that, well, defines the character of all governments. So if you're ever trying to sort of, what does this government say they are compared to how they actually behave in reality? Does the walk match the talk? And that's the only litmus test that you have to apply in order to correctly categorize a government. And with that filter test, that's the justification that I use to myself to basically claim that, communism, fascism, socialism, monarchy, dictatorship, all those things use as their model the consolidated power, consolidated freedom, consolidated choice model. And that's the form that they match. If you look at their forms, they match that. And really only capitalism is the only one that matches the other form, where rights and freedoms and the power to choose are decentralized. In other words, are actually owned by the individuals themselves, or in other words, the concept of ownership actually exists within the society. So that's the basic defining characteristic that splits types of governments into two larger categories. And you could get more complicated. You could go into the way those ideas are employed, and you could come up with more and more subcategories that are defined by how much they apply one of those two concepts. Is freedom and power and choice centralized or decentralized? Right. So I'm going to continue calling capitalism the one where those things are decentralized. But if you don't like that word, just remember that I'm talking about a system of government where rights exist, where freedoms exist, and where choice exists in the hands of the individual within the society, right? All of that stuff is decentralized. So the reason the reaction to Donald Trump and the war in Iran and the Epstein files and all that is concerning is because it's an overcorrection, right? Like, I don't think I'm being coy about where I'm going with things. I would say that it's an overcorrection, and the calculation that I see taking place to some extent, the calculation again is Trump equal bad, Republican equal bad, or Trump equal bad, therefore Republican equal bad, therefore Democrat equal good. That calculation is really not the problem, and it's basically the old way of doing things, where it's this bipartisan, I'm not actually sure what bipartisan means, where it's this two-party state. And, what arguments, when it comes to election time, what arguments does the party run on? What principles do they believe in and plan to abide by? What rules will they hold themselves to? You don't really hear much about that. What you hear more of is my opponent and their party has made X, Y, and Z mistakes, therefore they're bad, therefore I'm good. And you don't really hear much else. But that's the old calculation that's been going on for a long time, and hopefully we can see that even though it's natural, and it does seem to make some sense But ultimately, it's not good. And what will further demonstrate that it's not good is when you break down government into that defining characteristic, and you look at governments where power, freedom, and choice are not decentralized, where they're centralized into the hands of a few. And that includes, again, your fascism, your communism, your socialism, your dictatorship, your monarchy, all the other isms besides capitalism. And again, if you don't like the words, just rethink of the defining characteristic. Anytime that choice and stuff are consolidated, well, obviously, I think that that's a bad thing. And obviously, I'm going to say that's a bad thing. But why would I say that's a bad thing? Very briefly, like, there is a track record for communist and socialist states failing, which is, I guess, not as good of an argument as it used to be, since obviously we see quote-unquote capitalism. We don't really see capitalism failing in front of our eyes because what we have today is not capitalism, blah, 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 blah. Anyways, so if the Democrats can be called the party of communism or socialism, and I agree that's a wicked oversimplification, but it's not when you come to the overly simplistic picture of things. So to the extent that the oversimplistic picture of things has any truth to it, then the Democrats would also achieve the same thing, the same end item, the same end goal, the same last final state that the Trump administration and the Republicans are achieving today, which is centralized power, right? So it's not like the glaring fact that the Trump administration is evil is changing Democratic policy or the Democrat Party policy. They're still the same party. They just look a lot better these days, which I agree they do, which is crazy. But yeah, they look a lot better these days, so they'll probably get a lot of votes in the upcoming election, which for the nature of your government that you live under, and if you want it to be a place where freedoms and choice are things that actually exist to the individual, if you want it to be that kind of a place, the result of having the Democrats be back in charge is not necessarily a good thing for that. And I've already said that the Trump and Republican Party these days are clearly, obviously, glaringly evil. And I would much rather the Democrats win all the midterm elections. As I'm speaking right now, it's the 17th of March, 2026, and so I'm not defending, Republicans, the current power holding Republicans. And I'm in favor of the Democrats winning all the midterm elections and the following presidential election to come and all of that. But the problem is this calculation. Like, if we as a people keep operating according to that calculation, this party messed up bad, therefore the other party is good, their policies and decision making are good. That's the old way of doing things. That's the way we've always done it. And if the objective is to keep rights and freedoms owned by the individual, then that's not going to work. That method of calculation is not going to achieve the nature of government that people want. If people are doing what's in their own best interests, which I would define as, keeping your power to choose, keeping your rights and freedoms, keeping those things. And if you think that socialism is good, if you think that communism is good or one of those other things, and I touched briefly on the track record of communism and socialism, not because I know my facts or whatever, but I know sort of what arguments get used in a debate. And the failure rate of communism and socialism is an argument that's used against them all the time. So I didn't, sift through statistics and facts and stuff this is transparency, to come up with my opinions. I'm going on principles, I hope. That's my intention, is I'm going on principles. Like, I want freedom to exist to me. I want the power to control my own fate. I want the power to choose. And so I think that makes me a capitalist, even though that word, most people don't understand what it means, or maybe it doesn't mean the same thing as it used to because of the way we've used it. But anyways, I would define what is in the best interest of the individual to keep those things. And the reason that it makes sense to me that communism and socialism would have those high failure rates that get used against them in debates, the reason that makes sense to me, since I'm trying to operate on principles, is for a very good reason that was wisely called out in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, when it said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? So I basically think that by the very nature of the existence of an individual, like by the fact that you exist, what is naturally a consequence of, or an attribute of, the individual, and what is quote unquote indivisible or inseparable, is the fact that you are free to choose. So that's a truth of reality. That's determined by reality itself. Reality says, or we observe reality, and we observe this fact in reality, that the individual is free to choose its own course of action by its very nature. And it's inseparable in the same way that an attribute is inseparable from an object, So if you look at any object, like a ball or something, this is a very fundamental idea, the inseparability of freedom from the individual. So I really want to harp on it. So if you look at a ball, that is an object, and it has a shape. Most objects do have shapes. Most objects do have colors. Most objects have hardness. They have attributes, right? And if you change the attribute, you change the object. You cannot separate the shape from the object, right? Like, you imagine trying to do that, and the object ceases to exist. This is why I say that communism and socialism, their failure rates make sense because, according to reality, individuals must be free. But within those social systems, they are not. They do not have the power to choose their own fate. That power lies in the hands of a few. So this is a natural contradiction. Okay, so why would a natural contradiction fail? Well, basically, you can't defy the laws of reality, right? Think of another one. What does it take in order to exist? You have to eat, you have to sleep, you have to breathe air, you need shelter, so on and so forth. There's a group of things that we would call requirements of life, right? So if you don't listen to nature, if you don't obey reality, that's self-destruction, you know. Reality says that you have to eat in order to stay alive. You may not want to stay alive. Well, you follow rules appropriate to what you want to achieve. If you want to live, you must eat. If you do not want to live, then don't eat. It's very simple. But anyways, that explains, in my opinion, the high failure rate of those social systems in a principled manner, which is what I'm going for, rather than a statistical or factual based, you know, I'm not going to publish a paper with pie charts and stuff. I'm not going to sift through, you know, hundreds of thousands of facts. I have to operate mentally based on principles. And I feel like the logic on this one is pretty good. Like, I'm pretty happy with myself. I find my own reason to be consistent and logical and valid when I say that there's a very good reason why communism and socialism fail, and it's because they violate this basic fact of reality. Okay, so that's why the high failure rate of those social systems makes sense, and that's why that calculation of Republican bad automatically means that Democrat good is not a good calculation, because it doesn't work towards the principles that are in the best interest of the individuals. In other words, what you don't like about Donald Trump and the Republican Party is the power consolidation. That's what you don't like about it. You know, among the other disgusting things. But what you're going to get if you react according to that calculation is the same thing. And the only thing that stops that from happening is actually recognizing the actual problem of what's going on today. And I guess it's time for me to get to that. So, the actual problem is not capitalism. The actual problem is the way government funding is procured. The actual problem is basically a happy marriage between corrupt rich money and corrupt politicians. Now, that's not a problem that's unique to capitalism. I hear the word oligarchs thrown around a lot today. And I don't even know what that word means, but it seems like capitalism has a problem where it's weak against the idea that if rich corrupt people want to own the government, it's very easy to do within a capitalist system. But I'm here to say that that is a feature of every social system. There is not a single government alive today or have ever been, I think, that does not have the problem of being weak against big corrupt money, being in a happy marriage with corrupt politicians. There is not a social system that is weak against that. That is a bug within all social systems. But the problem is worse with a communism and socialism system, because in that case it's actually written into the nature of the government that happy marriage between big money and corrupt government should exist. It's actually written into the very nature of those things, by the principled fact that power and choice, etc., are consolidated into the hands of a few. Obviously, those few would determine who gets the money. Obviously, they would determine who gets the resources. They would determine everything, right? That's what the whole founding principle of the government style is about. Like, a few people decide everything. So obviously, they're going to decide who gets the money. So that doesn't necessarily imply that corruption will win out, but It sort of greases the wheels, I think. But anyways, the point is not, which one raises to self-destruction the fastest. I have my opinion, and I haven't, and, everybody else has their opinion. You can say whichever one you want. The point is, that's the result that we don't want to achieve, and that's the real problem. So if I've documented my thoughts correctly, then I've achieved saying that capitalism is not the problem. The actual problem is how the government is funded, and that's what you have to work on. Now, this is the solution to this problem is not something that I've worked on deeply, because I just sort of had this thought where everything came together in one, and I could make this persuasive argument where the actual problem is, how should a capitalist society handle government funding such that it is more resilient against rich, corrupt individuals being able to consolidate power, right? So that's the whole point here. I'm not going to be able to go into a solution. I'm going to be able to sketch out the overall objective of the solution. The overall objective is to separate money and government. And I've thought of some things, and I don't know how good these ideas are, but the point of them communicates the idea. And one of the things I thought of was, it's very expensive for somebody to run for president. And I thought that the funding for campaigns could just be set aside by the government. And every candidate, and obviously you can't have 20,000 candidates for president. You have to have some sort of process of whittling down how many candidates are allowed to run for president. But anyways, process X is in place, and it's able to whittle down the number of candidates in some fair manner that everybody pretty much agrees with is decently fair, so that every candidate gets the same amount of money for their campaign. And it's in a fund in the government that's labeled presidential candidate funding. Now, so that's an idea, and I don't care if that's a good idea. All I care is that you only get a certain amount of money for your presidential campaign, and your opponent gets the same amount of money. There's no hey, rich people, the presidential office is basically purchased today. So if you want to purchase the presidential office, you better give me a lot of money, and I'll, fast track favorable laws for you when I get in. There's none of that. There's no appeal for that, because you have a set amount for your campaign. Anyways, is that a good idea? I don't know. I haven't thought about it too much. Again, the point is to think of ideas that would address the weakness of capitalism, or the weakness of any system, that involves this happy marriage between big corrupt money and corrupt politicians. Basically, we want a separation between those two things. That's the real problem. Capitalism is not the problem. That's the real problem. And hopefully I hear more of this being called out in the future days to come, rather than that old and bad calculation. Republicans equal bad, Democrats equal good, and vice versa, because it happens the other way too, obviously. But hopefully that happens. I don't care, though. What I really care about is documenting my thoughts. And I think that I've said everything I have to say for now on the subject. And I'm going to stop recording.